The silence was not peace. It was fear, a nation trapped beneath its own shadow. Under Nazi rule, every whisper could mean death. Every act of kindness, treason, yet in the darkest corners of Germany, a quiet resistance began to rise. Ordinary people who risked everything and were almost forgotten by history. In the heart of Europe, silence became survival. When Hitler's empire spread across the continent, millions faced a terrible choice: obey or disappear. Cities drowned in propaganda. Radios spoke with one voice. Flags of red and black swallowed every skyline. But beneath that obedience, something flickered. The quiet refusal of ordinary souls. Teachers who skipped a line of doctrine, mothers who hid forbidden books, clerks who delayed a report that could kill. In a world built on fear, silence itself became rebellion. And while the Reich marched louder with every victory, those whispers began to multiply, unseen but unbroken. It began with a whisper and a choice. To speak was treason. To remain silent was complicity. Inside Germany, a handful of university students could no longer bear the lies. They called themselves the White Rose. They printed leaflets on a small press, words etched with trembling courage. We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. Each paper fluttered through the air like a spark in the darkness, calling for truth, for freedom, for moral awakening. Their message spread across campuses, churches, and factories. And somewhere deep in the Reich's heart, the Gestapo listened. The clock of their courage was already ticking. Beyond Germany's borders, defiance took quieter forms. In the occupied Netherlands, an aging piano teacher transformed her studio into a refuge, children hidden behind a false wall, their laughter stifled beneath the sound of Chopin. In France, a railway worker loosened bolts, derailing supply trains under the cover of night. In Denmark, fishermen rowed through moonless waters, carrying families toward Sweden's shore.
Ow.
They didn't call themselves heroes. They were neighbors, teachers, lovers, risking everything not for glory, but for decency. Every saved life was a victory unrecorded. Every heartbeat in hiding defied a war that demanded silence and obedience. Fear ruled every breath. Under Nazi law, suspicion was a weapon. A careless word could end a life. Gestapo listened through walls, informants traded rumors for rations. Children were taught to report their parents. Trust evaporated like smoke. Yet even under that suffocating terror, some hearts refused to yield. They found courage in the smallest gestures, a hidden letter, a smuggled ration card, a quiet nod of defiance. Resistance became invisible, but not extinct. It lived in the pauses between words, in the eyes of strangers who dared to care. And sometimes, silence spoke louder than any shout. In Munich, February 1943, the White Rose made their final stand. Sophie Scholl, only 21, carried a suitcase filled with leaflets to the university. She scattered them from a balcony, papers drifting like snow through the courtyard below. Freedom, one read, can only exist where the human spirit is free. Within hours, she and her brother Hans were arrested. Within days, executed by guillotine, their deaths were meant to silence dissent. Instead, they ignited a legacy. Their leaflets, smuggled to Britain, were dropped across Germany by Allied planes. The Reich tried to erase their voices, but the world had already begun to listen. Across the channel, the BBC broadcast their story. It was proof that somewhere inside the Reich, conscience still breathed. There are Germans who resist, the announcer said softly. They fight not with guns, but with truth. For listeners in the occupied lands, those words felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They reminded millions that not all of Germany marched in lockstep. Some still stood, trembling, terrified, but unbroken. Hope spread across the airwaves, disguised as news. The Nazis could jam frequencies, confiscate radios, threaten death for listening. But they couldn't stop the sound of truth once it had found its echo. Yet resistance was never pure. In the ghettos of Warsaw, silence carried both salvation and betrayal. Some risked everything to hide a neighbor, others informed to survive another day. The line between courage and compromise blurred under hunger and fear. In darkened apartments, families whispered prayers they no longer believed. "We cannot save everyone," one man said, his voice breaking. Still, he opened his door. Each act of mercy felt like gambling with fate, and losing was inevitable. Under Nazi rule, morality was no longer a rule to follow. It was a light to protect, flickering against a storm. Even the church trembled under tyranny. In the German town of Munster, Bishop Clemens August von Galen dared to denounce Hitler's secret euthanasia program, the systematic murder of the disabled. "No man," he declared from his pulpit, "has the right to take another's life." His words thundered through cathedrals and prisons alike. People wept. The Gestapo raged. But Hitler hesitated. Killing a bishop might awaken more than fear. It might awaken faith. Von Galen survived the war, but his sermons became whispered scripture among the oppressed. The cross, for a moment, stood against the swastika and refused to bow. In Norway, resistance wore the face of ordinary people. When the Nazis demanded that teachers spread propaganda, thousands refused. They were fired, imprisoned, and exiled to labor camps. But they didn't yield. In freezing classrooms, children learned forbidden lessons, that truth mattered, that conscience couldn't be conquered. Women carried coded messages inside loaves of bread. Fishermen mapped enemy patrols, pretending to cast nets. Oh, their defiance wasn't loud or cinematic. It was quiet, consistent, and human. A nation occupied by force had chosen to resist through integrity. Their greatest weapon was unity, and their silence unbreakable. Art became rebellion. In Berlin's smoky basements, jazz bands played forbidden American songs. The saxophones cried out where words could not. Every note mocked the regime that called jazz degenerate. In occupied Paris, poets wrote verses that hid messages beneath metaphor. Paintings carried symbols of freedom and strokes of color the Gestapo couldn't decipher. Pen, the brush, the horn, all became weapons against tyranny. In a world where truth was illegal, beauty became a form of protest. And though the Nazis burned books and censored every word, that kept breathing, waiting for liberation's first light. The Gestapo understood the danger. This war wasn't only about tanks or territory, it was about control of the human soul. They invaded kitchens, churches, schools. They hunted whispers as if they were bullets. Every arrest was a warning, every public execution, a performance of power. And yet, the leaflets kept appearing. Coded prayers were passed under communion bread. Children delivered secret notes in baskets of apples. Even in the concentration camps, prisoners carved messages into walls. "Remember us." The right could crush bodies, but not memory. It was fighting an enemy it couldn't see, an idea that refused to die. In France, a young woman named Lucie Aubrec became a living legend. Pregnant, fearless, she orchestrated daring escapes for captured resistance leaders. When her husband was taken by the Gestapo, she outwitted them with forged papers and bold lies. Her story spread across occupied Europe, a tale of love stronger than fear. "We fought not to win," she said later, "but not to lose ourselves." Each mission felt like walking through fire. But even surrounded by terror, she smiled in defiance. The Gestapo called her the Ghost to those she saved. She was proof that humanity could survive even in hell. Inside Germany itself, protection became resistance. Families hid Jewish neighbors in basements and barns. Doctors falsified medical certificates. Priests baptized strangers to erase their names from deportation lists. Every false paper, every forged signature was an act of rebellion and a death sentence if discovered. Some were caught, others endured to the end of the war, without ever being known. Their bravery remained hidden in family diaries and whispers over kitchen tables. They fought not for history books, but for one another. Their silence was not fear, it was love. Wrapped in secrecy, sealed with courage, but resistance was fragmented and fragile. Cells operated in isolation, terrified of betrayal. No one knew who to trust. A captured comrade could doom an entire network with a single word under torture. Yet somehow, their messages found ways to travel. A phrase carved into a cell wall, melody hummed through prison bars, a loaf of bread carrying a name scrawled inside. Every act connected the unseen, a web of courage spanning a continent. They didn't know it then, but together, they were building the moral backbone of Europe's rebirth. One silent act at a time. By 1943, The Reich stood at its height. Its armies occupied half of Europe. Its symbols burned into every city. But beneath that triumph, the quiet war deepened. Networks began to merge. French, Polish, Norwegian, German. They weren't bound by ideology, but by conscience. They met in barns, in chapels, in forest clearings, united by the belief that decency still mattered. They knew they might never live to see liberation, yet they fought on, because to do nothing was to die inside. The guns of the Allies would win the war, but the silent resistors kept humanity alive. The more the Reich tightened its grip, the more the silence fought back. Across Europe, secret presses multiplied like wildfire. Pamphlets poured from basements, attics, and hidden sheds. Messages disguised as recipes or prayers carried orders, maps, and names. Resistance was no longer scattered. It was organized, deliberate, coordinated through whispers. But with unity came danger. The Gestapo adapted, infiltrating networks, turning prisoners into spies. Every handshake could be betrayal. Every meeting could be the last. Yet still they gathered, candlelight flickering over faces worn by fear and purpose. They had no armies, no armor, only conviction. And conviction was becoming costly. The Gestapo's shadow reached everywhere. Agents moved through villages like ghosts, listening, watching, waiting. They broke networks with terrifying precision. Captured courier could unravel an entire operation within hours. Families vanished overnight, leaving only boarded windows and silence. In Paris, a single informant led to hundreds of arrests. In Berlin, a mother was executed for hiding her son's resistance leaflets. Fear became a weapon sharper than bullets. And still, the underground refused to die. Even if they kill us all, one priest wrote before his execution, they cannot kill the idea that made us stand. The Reich feared that idea most. Inside the camps, resistance took a different shape. At Auschwitz, prisoners documented every horror, scribbling names, dates, and testimonies onto scraps of paper buried in the ground. In Sobibor and Treblinka, uprisings erupted, doomed but defiant. Women smuggled gunpowder inside hems of dresses. Men sabotaged crematoriums with stolen tools. They knew escape was impossible, but silence was worse. To resist even for a moment was to reclaim a fragment of humanity. We were already dead, one survivor later said. But for one day, we were free. These acts were small, brief sparks, yet in that darkness, they burned with unbearable light. Back in Germany, the war had turned. Defeats in Stalingrad and Africa cracked the illusion of Nazi invincibility. Rations dwindled. Bombs fell nightly. And within that chaos, new voices rose. Officers, bureaucrats, even aristocrats began to plot against Hitler himself. They called it Operation Valkyrie. Its goal, assassinate the Führer and end the madness. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg placed the bomb with trembling hands inside a conference room. It exploded, but Hitler survived. The plan collapsed in hours. Thousands were executed. The silent resistance that had endured for years now bled openly, crushed by the regime's final fury. The aftermath was merciless. Stauffenberg and his conspirators were hanged with piano wire filmed for Hitler's amusement. Friends, families, and secretaries were rounded up, accused of knowing too much. Entire circles of dissent vanished overnight. But even in failure, something changed. For the first time, the world saw that Germany itself had tried to kill its tyrant. That revelation would later shape how history remembered the German people, not as a single chorus of obedience, but as a divided nation, torn between fear and conscience. The cost was unbearable. But their sacrifice cracked the myth of Nazi perfection forever. For many resistors, survival became the final act of defiance. Those who remained alive lived in constant dread of betrayal, of discovery, of silence itself. In occupied Poland, children served as messengers, pretending to sell newspapers as they carried secret reports to the Allies. In Denmark, entire villages coordinated rescues, warning Jewish families minutes before raids began. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they didn't. But each attempt, no matter how small, carved a fracture into Hitler's total control. The Reich demanded total submission. The people answered with quiet disobedience, the kind that outlasts bullets and burns deeper than propaganda ever could. As the Allies advanced, Nazi paranoia grew. Every bombing, every retreat, fueled suspicion within the ranks. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Officers executed their own men for cowardice. Inside Germany, propaganda screamed louder, desperate to drown out reality. But the silent networks listened. They began to prepare not for victory, but for survival after collapse. Teachers buried banned books in gardens. Priests hid sacred art in catacombs. Scholars copied documents to expose Nazi crimes when the war was over. They were preparing history's evidence, line by line, risking death to ensure truth would not vanish with them. The price of silence was measured in lives. In Belgium, a priest named Joseph André sheltered over 200 Jewish children. Forging baptism papers to disguise their identities, he survived the war, but never spoke of it, haunted by those he couldn't save. In Prague, students who defied occupation were executed in public squares, their deaths meant as warning. Instead, they became symbols. For every act of terror, a story of resistance followed, sometimes known, often forgotten. The Nazis controlled history for a moment. But history, like truth, has a way of resurfacing, whispered at first, then louder with every generation. Women carried much of the resistance on their shoulders. They were couriers, nurses, spies, invisible, underestimated, unstoppable. In Poland, Irana Sendler smuggled thousands of children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, hiding their names in glass jars buried beneath trees. In Germany, wives of Jewish men protested outside prisons, demanding their release, and won. They were dismissed as hysterical, but they refused to leave. Their courage wasn't forged in battlefields, but in kitchens, in queues for bread, in quiet defiance of impossible odds. History forgot their names, but their silence moved mountains. Every whisper carried a cost. A forged document meant death if discovered. A hidden radio could condemn an entire family, yet still, people listened to forbidden broadcasts, hearts racing as they tuned into London's voice, cutting through static. "This is the truth," it said, "and it cannot be silenced." Those few minutes of sound were worth every risk. Reminded them that outside the barbed wire of the Reich, the world still existed. That freedom was not a dream, just distant. And so they listened, knowing the knock on the door could come at any moment. Even within the Nazi elite, cracks appeared. Some officers, witnessing the genocide firsthand, began to question everything. They leaked information, forged documents, or intentionally delayed orders. A few even sabotaged transports, saving lives without ever revealing why. They couldn't speak, not in that world, but they acted. One SS officer wrote in his diary, later found in ruins, "I no longer believe in victory, only in judgment." It wasn't redemption, but it was resistance. In a regime built on obedience, hesitation became treason. And in that hesitation, the empire began to rot from within. The silent resistors often never knew the impact of their actions. A single leaflet could spark a movement. A smuggled ration card could keep a future scientist alive. A child rescued in 1942 might one day tell the story that proved the world wrong. They couldn't see beyond the smoke and terror, but their choices shaped generations. The Reich wanted obedience carved into memory. Instead, memory became rebellion. The smallest acts, unrecorded, uncelebrated, became the foundation for post-war justice. Silence had preserved the truth, hidden beneath ashes, waiting to be heard once the shouting stopped. By 1944, the walls were closing in. Allies bombed German cities to rubble. Millions fled as the front collapsed. In basements and forests, resistance groups prepared for the end. But their hope wasn't triumph. It was survival long enough to see dawn. "We've lived too long in shadows," one French partisan wrote. "Oh, if we die, let it be knowing we didn't stay silent." They had no illusions of glory. Many would never see liberation, yet even as the Reich fell into madness, the silent resistors stood firm. They had already beaten Hitler where he could never win in the human spirit. In Berlin's final days, chaos replaced control. The Gestapo burned records, erasing names of those they'd killed. Civilians fled, soldiers deserted, and in the ruins, silence returned, not of fear, but of exhaustion. Some resistors emerged from hiding, blinking into daylight for the first time in years. They had survived, but the world they knew was gone. "We fought for life," one survivor said softly, "but we found ghosts." Their victory felt hollow, yet sacred. For though the Reich had crushed bodies, it never conquered the will to remain human. That, in the end, was the quietest triumph. When the guns finally fell silent, the world began to listen. What emerged from the ruins wasn't just destruction, it was testimony. Diaries, letters, and coded messages revealed an invisible war fought without armies. Teachers, priests, nurses, farmers, their resistance had no medals, no monuments, but it was real. The Allies won the battle. Silent ones won the meaning. Their courage reminded humanity that conscience cannot be occupied. And as post-war trials exposed the depths of the Nazi nightmare, their voices, once whispers in the dark, became the moral echo that history could never erase. The war had ended, but the silence remained. Across a broken Europe, survivors emerged from basements, forests, and concentration camps. Blinking into daylight, they barely remembered. Their homes were gone, their families missing. And yet amid the rubble, fragments of the silent resistance began to surface. Letters found in walls, leaflets buried under floorboards, secret diaries hidden in jars. Each artifact spoke of defiance, small, human, and unrecorded. Historians would later call it the conscience of Europe, but for those who lived it, it was simpler than that. It was the sound of humanity refusing to die. Even in hell, Germany itself faced a reckoning unlike any in history. The nation stood shattered, morally, spiritually, physically. Many asked, how could this have happened? Beneath that question, another whisper, did anyone resist? In the ashes of the Reich, the answer began to emerge. Testimonies of the White Rose, the July 20th conspirators, and hidden protectors of Jews reached Allied hands. They were few, yes, but they existed. "We were not all blind," one surviving resistor told an American officer. "Some of us tried to see." His words captured the moral fracture of a nation learning to live again under the weight of its silence. The Nuremberg trials became the world's attempt at justice. Inside the courtroom, the voices of the silent were finally heard, through letters, photos, and trembling witnesses who had survived the camps. The defendants called it victor's justice, but for the nameless millions, it was justice long overdue. Prosecutors presented evidence smuggled by resistors, lists preserved by priests, testimonies from doctors who defied orders. Each word struck like a hammer on history's anvil. The world learned that resistance hadn't died, it had documented. It had remembered. And now in that courtroom, the silence that once hid from death spoke truth to power. But justice is never clean. Many resistors returned to towns that no longer existed, only to be met with suspicion, even hostility. Neighbors whispered, "Why are you still alive?" Survivors carried invisible guilt, for those they couldn't save, for living when others didn't. Some kept their stories buried for decades. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were simply people who refused to stop being human. "I did what anyone should have done," one woman said, her voice shaking, but history knew better. Their quiet defiance had carried the moral weight of nations, even if they never wanted the credit. Across France, monuments rose to honor the resistance. Yet behind the parades and medals, darker questions lingered. Who collaborated? Who stayed silent? Who profited from fear? The lines blurred quickly. For every celebrated hero, there were thousands who had watched in silence, doing nothing. That silence haunted post-war Europe like a ghost. It became a mirror, forcing nations to ask not what the Nazis had done to them, but what they had done to themselves. The war had ended, but the battle for memory had just begun. In that war, truth was the only weapon left. In the Netherlands, survivors rebuilt from the sea of loss. Entire Jewish neighborhoods had vanished, their residents erased. Yet the names of those who resisted began to surface. Teachers who hid children in schools. Farmers who fed the hunted. Librarians who smuggled fake IDs. The Dutch called them the helpers. They never sought recognition. But decades later, when researchers uncovered their records, one phrase repeated in every account. We couldn't just watch. It wasn't heroism they spoke of, it was decency. The kind of courage that doesn't shout or pose for cameras, the kind that acts. It keeps the secret forever. In Poland, the scars ran deepest. The country had bled for resistance. Millions dead, cities erased, yet even amid unimaginable loss, stories of defiance endured. Underground schools had taught forbidden history. Couriers carried messages between partisans and forests. Priests baptized Jewish children under false names. Polish Home Army's efforts became legend. But the quiet civilian bravery, the mothers, the teachers, the nameless, often vanished from textbooks. Still they existed, immortalized in fragments of testimony. One line appeared again and again. We wanted to live as humans, even when humanity was forbidden. That was their rebellion. For Germany, remembrance was an open wound. In the ruins of Munich, survivors of the White Rose were honored, but cautiously. The new West German state wanted unity, not guilt. The East claimed the moral high ground, branding itself the anti-fascist nation. Yet both sides struggled with silence. Some former Nazis became teachers, judges, officials. Others faded into obscurity. True resistors were respected, but often forgotten. Their stories didn't fit the political narrative. For many, the silence continued. Not out of fear this time, but fatigue. It would take a new generation to ask again. What would we have done? Decades passed. The ruins became cities again. The graves became monuments. But the silence never fully lifted. Children asked their grandparents what they had done during the war, and were met with hesitation, half-truths, or tears. Some discovered hidden letters in attics. Others learned their family had once hidden a stranger. Each revelation cracked open the past, revealing both shame and grace. The resistance wasn't a story of nations, it was a story of choices. And those choices, whispered across time, reminded Europe of its most painful truth. Evil thrives not only through action, but through silence. As the 20th century marched on, memory turned to education. Museums rose where torture chambers once stood. School children read the words of Sophie Scholl and Irena Sendler. Documentaries unearthed lost testimonies, voices trembling but unbroken. Scholars debated whether resistance had mattered militarily. But emotionally, morally, it had changed everything. It proved that even in the heart of tyranny, goodness could exist without hope of victory. One teacher in Berlin told her students, "These people didn't fight to win. They fought to remain human." And in that sentence, the entire story of silent resistance lived on. The survivors aged, their numbers dwindling. Their memories, fragile but luminous, became warnings to a world too quick to forget. Some gave interviews, their hands trembling as they spoke names not uttered in 50 years. Others wrote letters to grandchildren, explaining why silence had been both shield and prison. "We kept quiet to survive," one woman wrote, "but the truth still wanted to be heard." As they faded, their stories became inheritance, a moral legacy, reminding generations born into peace that freedom is not loud. Sometimes, it's a whisper that refuses to die. The wounds of collaboration and betrayal never fully healed. Even decades later, families discovered secrets a relative who had informed. A friend who had hidden Jews, a father who had worn the uniform. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Some nations built myths of unity. Others avoided the subject entirely. But silence, once again, became dangerous. The survivors' testimonies broke it open. They forced the world to confront what happens when fear outweighs conscience. And in that confrontation, humanity found its mirror scarred, divided, but still capable of reflection. The truth was painful, but it was necessary. From the ashes of occupation, art once again spoke first. Writers turned trauma into poetry. Filmmakers recreated the quiet heroism that history had overlooked. Painters captured the faces of those who refused to bow. Through film and literature, the silent resistance finally found its voice translated into the language of the living. In one haunting film, an old man whispered, "We didn't fight Hitler to be remembered. We fought him so there would be something left to remember." That line echoed through theaters across the world, reminding audiences that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply refuses to disappear. Across generations, silence transformed into warning. Teachers told their students, "Tyranny begins not with violence, but with obedience." Politicians invoked the past to defend democracy. The quiet courage of the forgotten became moral armor for the present. Yet with every decade, distance grew. History became documentary. Suffering became symbol. The question remained, Would we be silent too? The question, lingering, uncomfortable, became the legacy of those who had once risked everything just to whisper the truth. The war had ended long ago, but the silence it revealed still lives in the human heart. By the century's end, the silent resistance had become legend, not for its victories, but for its values. It reminded the world that even when surrounded by cruelty, humanity can endure through conscience alone. Their struggle wasn't about overthrowing an empire, it was about saving the soul of mankind. Every hidden act, every whispered word, every life saved in secret formed a mosaic of moral defiance. And though history often celebrates battles won with guns, this one was different. It was fought with faith, patience, and silence. And somehow, against all odds, it won. Time passed, but memory never died. As Europe rebuilt its cities, it also rebuilt its conscience. Plaques and statues appeared where executions had once taken place. Streets bore names of the fallen Sophie Scholl, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Irana Sendler. But the true memorials were invisible. Conversations between generations, the quiet retelling of stories once too painful to share. Historians began calling it the second resistance, the resistance of remembrance. For in remembering, humanity defied tyranny once more. Every act of memory was an act of rebellion against forgetting. Forgetting, they knew, was how evil begins again. The world vowed never again. Yet the echoes of authoritarianism returned in new faces, new flags, new languages. Each time survivors recognized the pattern: fear, propaganda, obedience disguised as patriotism. They warned the young this is how it starts. Some listened. Others dismissed it as history. But history, like silence, has a way of returning. The moral lesson of the silent resistance wasn't just about courage, it was about vigilance. It taught the world that democracy isn't self-sustaining. It must be protected, daily, sometimes loudly in protest, and sometimes quietly in the refusal to conform. In the United States and the United Kingdom, these stories struck a deep chord. They resonated with a people who had fought tyranny from afar, yet never lived under its constant shadow. Documentaries, novels, and films carried these stories across oceans. Viewers wept at the quiet bravery of ordinary souls who risked everything, not for glory, but for decency. The lesson transcended nationality. Evil wasn't foreign, it was human, and so was courage. One British historian said, "Their silence was not weakness, it was strategy, the last weapon of the powerless." In that paradox lay the essence of humanity's greatest resistance, to remain good when goodness seems impossible. Generations born into peace began asking dangerous questions. What would I have done? Would I have spoken up? The uncomfortable truth was, no one could ever be sure. The silent resistance stripped away the illusion of moral certainty. It forced people to confront the fragility of conscience under pressure. Students debated in classrooms, filmmakers staged reenactments, musicians composed haunting scores inspired by whispers of defiance. Through art and reflection, the memory lived. Because what terrified the world most wasn't the evil itself, but how ordinary it had once seemed, and how icily silence had made it possible. Psychologists called it collective guilt, an entire continent haunted by what it didn't do. Therapists treated survivors who still woke up at night, hearing footsteps outside their door. Children of collaborators carried shame they never earned. And yet among all that pain, something beautiful emerged: empathy, the ability to see another's suffering as one's own. The silent resistance became not just a story of defiance, but a mirror for healing. They taught us, wrote one German author, that being human means saying no, even when no one will hear it. That lesson became Europe's most fragile, precious inheritance. By the dawn of the 21st century, archives opened like wounds. Thousands of unseen letters, photographs, and personal diaries came to light. Families discovered that a grandmother had sheltered fugitives, or that an uncle had printed banned leaflets in a cellar. The world finally met its forgotten heroes, not soldiers, but civilians, bakers, teachers, nuns, mechanics. They had no medals, no uniforms, no parades. Just the quiet certainty that right was still right, even when the law said otherwise. Their rediscovered stories became proof that moral courage doesn't vanish, it only waits for someone to look again. In Berlin, under the gray sky of remembrance, a museum guide speaks softly to a group of students. She points to a wall of portraits, hundreds of faces, none famous. They resisted, she says, not to win, but to stay human. The students stand silent. Some look away, others cry. For a moment, history feels alive again, not as dates and battles, but as choices. That moment is the legacy the silent resistance left behind, the understanding that freedom is not inherited, it's earned over and over. It's through empathy, through conscience, through the courage to whisper no when everyone else stays quiet. Around the world, modern activists quote those same resistors. Their words appear on protest banners, art murals, and social media posts. We will not be silent. One must have a conscience. Freedom lives in the mind. The echoes of Nazi-occupied Europe now inspire movements from Hong Kong to Tehran. The contexts differ, but the core remains the same. A belief that silence when confronted with evil is a choice. The faces change, but the spirit endures. The whisper that once risked death now roars through digital screens. History refuses to rest. Still, the greatest danger isn't forgetting the past. It's believing we would have done better. Every generation thinks it would have been braver, louder, more righteous, but the truth is harder. Resistance is never easy when survival is at stake. That's why their story matters. It humbles us. It warns us. It reminds us that evil rarely demands our hatred, only our obedience. And in that small surrender, everything is lost. The silent resistance showed the opposite, that even when victory is impossible, integrity is still worth dying for. Because silence is never neutral. Today, in classrooms across Europe, children read their names aloud. They learn that history isn't made by generals, but by choices. They reenact the leaflets of the White Rose, the courage of Polish teachers, the kindness of Danish sailors. And when they ask, why didn't everyone resist? The answer comes softly because courage is rare. The silence of those who dared to defy tyranny has become a compass for conscience. It points forward, not backward, because the true goal of remembering the past is to protect the future. That's what they died for. That's why we tell their story. The ruins have turned to monuments. But beneath the stone, beneath the names carved in marble, lies something deeper, the invisible legacy of choice. A whisper in every democracy, reminding us that freedom's greatest enemy is indifference. The silent resistance wasn't just history. It was a warning, a living one. Evil triumphs, said Edmund Burke, when good men do nothing. But what he didn't say was this: even when good men can't win, they can still try. And that effort, however, small, becomes the thread that holds civilization together. Under Nazi rule, silence was both weapon and shield. But in the end, it became the story's greatest irony, because that same silence, once meant to hide, became the loudest testimony of all. The voices of the forgotten now speak across time, carried by film, by word, by memory. They remind us that history's greatest heroism doesn't always march in daylight. Sometimes it hides in the dark, waiting for someone to listen. And when we listen, truly listen, the silence breaks, and what emerges is not just history, but humanity itself. If you close your eyes, you can still hear them. The scratching of pens on forbidden paper, the quiet shuffle of feet in cellars, the whispered prayers of mothers holding their breath as soldiers pass by. It's faint, but it's there. The sound of people who refuse to surrender their souls. The world owes its conscience to those whispers. They remind us that resistance isn't measured in battles won, but in humanity preserved. And maybe, just maybe, their silence still speaks to us, telling us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear. History will continue to test us. New tyrannies will rise, lies will spread, fear will return. It always does. But somewhere, someone will remember these faces, these names, these whispers, and they will choose differently. They will resist, not with weapons, but with truth. Not for power, but for principle. That's the legacy of the silent resistance. It wasn't about defeating the Nazis. It was about proving that the human spirit can't be crushed by fear. That even in darkness, there will always be light, if someone dares to carry it. So when you finish this story, Don't let it fade. Let it echo. Let it question. Let it remind you that silence in the face of cruelty is a choice one history will remember. The silent resistance wasn't just a chapter in the past. It's a mirror held to every generation. Look into it and ask yourself, what would I have done?
Yes.
Then take that answer and do something with it. Speak, create, act, because history is still being written, and sometimes the smallest voice can change the fate of the world.